to today's broadcast of North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of NIC television students, and your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
I wish to start our program today by thanking Lewis Clark State College from Lewiston, Idaho, for our guests being here. That particular college is engaging at this time in the 8th Annual International Exchange Conference. This year they have chosen to discuss the relationship between the United States and Canada. And we're most unfortunate they have permitted us to have as our guest today author M. Goddard, who is with the Canadian Consulate Office in Seattle. His position is Political, Economic, and Academic Relations Officer for Canada at the Seattle office. Our guest has also just completed 9 years as a political scientist at Simon Fraser University. Mr. Goddard, it's a very great pleasure to have you on our program.
Thank you very much.
And I'm very happy to have our regular panelists here today to answer our questions. To my immediate left is Steve Schenck, who is Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and next to him is Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in Idaho, and I shall ask Janelle Burke to commence the questioning.
Dr. Goddard, you've been here talking with the students about the two countries. Can you tell us, why is our relationship with Canada so special as the United States and Canada? Why is the relationship between the two countries a very close and special one?
I can't help but think about the border crossing at Blaine between British Columbia and Washington, where it says children of a common mother. And I think basically our relationship is so close because, in fact, we were both from Great Britain, and I think we've grown up together. I think the fact that we have the longest border in the world undefended, I think the fact that we speak the same language, many cultural similarities, I think the fact that we've got relatives on both sides of the border, all these things, and of course one important thing is the amount of trade that we have. I think all these things make it a very special relationship. I don't think you could find many countries in the world that have such a close relationship as our two countries.
And I know that there are a lot of people who go to Canada to visit, and a lot of people from Canada who come to the United States to visit. And there's an interchange, of course, when one visits back and forth. Can you tell us how important is tourism to your country?
Tourism particularly, now I'm talking mostly in the British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest area, is a very important. In fact, tourism has become the second largest or the largest industry in the province of British Columbia. I'm not sure where it stands in Alberta. But I know that people, when they come to the Pacific Northwest, they like to make kind of a triangle visit. They usually like to go to Vancouver, perhaps Seattle, somewhere else in this area. People don't come here just to go to one place. They come here to go to British Columbia, Idaho, Washington, Montana, and that. So it's a very important industry, and it's the number of visits across the line on a daily basis is really something.
Do you have any idea how many people come from completely outside the area as opposed to those of us who live close to Canada and go there for like the weekend vacation? Do you have any idea what kind of percentages of people come back and
No,
forth?
I'm afraid I don't. In the consulate in Seattle, of course, we've got a full department concerned with tourism. And there also is a British Columbia provincial tourism in the Seattle area. And basically they've coordinated the tourism advertising campaign outside this area. But I'm sorry I can't actually provide the actual figures. But for example, I know that well over 44 million people in Canada every year visit this country. Now, of course, that means there's only 26 million Canadians, so some of them are coming twice, maybe it's 5 times, and somebody else is not coming. But it is overwhelmingly a large number of people go back and forth.
And then we shop when we go to Canada, and Canadians shop when they come to the United States.
Isn't that the truth? Particularly for certain goods. I think both of us find bargains on either side of the line, and that's one of the things we always do is shop.
Mr. Goddard, I know that you're so correct when you talk about what a good relationship there has been between the United States and Canada. It's like a family, but also family members have some disagreements. And one of the problems that has arisen from time to time is dealing with economic issues between the two countries and trade. That has been part of this conference that Lewis Clark State College has put on. Could you take a few minutes to inform our viewers about what appears to be a major breakthrough? Very recently, President Reagan was signing an agreement, and now your country has put that before the Parliament, dealing with free trade. Could you kind of walk us through what some of the problems were and how this treaty came about?
Well, interestingly enough, we've tried in the past to have free trade agreements between this country. Probably in the 1800s, at one time we actually did have a free trade agreement, and that was terminated after a number of years. Interestingly enough, way back in 1911, they had an agreement signed. They had a general election in Canada, and the government was defeated, so that agreement never came into effect. We tried it again about 1948, 1949. That never got off the ground, but now I think we've reached a point in the last 2 years we've been negotiating where we look like we've got a very good chance of bringing in a comprehensive free trade agreement. Now, this agreement, I might mention, is absolutely historical. It's the most important, probably, bilateral trade agreement between any two countries in the world. Actually, this agreement probably takes us further along the line to having free trade than the European Economic Community, for example, and they've been working at that for some 30 years. Now, it's a very complicated agreement, I might mention. Actually, the actual pages, there's over 1,600 pages, so it's about like a telephone book. But there are some general areas that I think are important, and perhaps maybe more important to this area. I think one thing, of course, is they're going to be reducing tariffs. The tariffs, once the agreement goes into effect over a 10-year period, basically tariffs will be eliminated. So in other words, when you buy a good and you go to the border, they won't be saying, gee, you have to pay this much more on this good. These will be eliminated over a 10-year period. Another area that I think that's going to be probably very important is in the area of disputes. For example, if we do have a trade disagreement between the two countries, there is a mechanism within this new free trade agreement where they will examine it. Instead of being able to complain, instead of one side being able to complain about it and not have a forum to discuss it with somebody else, or not having or introducing a law to counter what they consider an unfair trade practice, under this arrangement, we will sit down together, iron out the differences, and reach a mutual agreement, hopefully, on this area. Now, this is dispute settlement that's taken out of the realm of politics. There will be professional people who examine these disputes, equal representations from both sides of the border, and so supposedly when these things are solved, at least we'll have had the experts having their say-so, rather than having some people that perhaps maybe have political interests, or you might say interests of private interest groups or something involved. I think that's a very important aspect of this treaty. It sets the trade relationships on a legalistic basis, non-political basis in the future.
Sounds like that what's so important about that is that if there happens to be certain sentiment during the middle of a political campaign, that will be removed in the future.
Yes.
And candidates won't be playing to that for temporary advantage in the election.
Sure. I think our countries have had good experience in these type of agreements before. For example, the Boundary Waters Treaty and setting up an international commission to examine problems with water across the borders. And this worked out very successfully. Gets it out of the realm of politics and puts it into the realm where it should be.
Am I correct that this, if it goes into effect and is realized, will be one of the largest free trade zones in the world?
That's right. The goods, of course, between Canada and the United States are the largest trading relationship of any two countries in the world. Canada is your largest country by far and away. Some people think Japan is, but your goods with Canada are twice as large as Japan. In fact, your second largest trading partner is the province of Ontario alone. So we're going to create a market that, for example, I think is about 20% of the world's trade goods are gone. It's just between this bilateral relationship. And this is very, very important. And if you consider the industrialized country of the world, Canada and the United States trade about 30% of total trade between industrial countries. So this is the largest trading bloc we will be looking at in the world.
Thank you. Steve Sheen.
I'm going to guess, Dr. Goddard, that with an agreement this large, there had to be some give and take on both sides. Who are the winners and who are the losers? And I think both countries stand to win from the overall agreement, but I'm sure that each has the perspective of we're giving here and you're giving there. Who are some of those people or industries?
Well, I think you have to realize that for both countries there were certain dispute areas that they said perhaps they didn't even want to talk about in the treaty. One of the most areas, the largest trade between the two countries is in the automobile. The automobile industry happened to have been covered with a treaty back in 1965. Both countries said, gee, we'd like some of this treaty changed. Canada said, no, we don't want this changed. You said, we don't want this changed. And so they decided to leave the automobile trade the way it was, for example. Another area that's important in your area, for example, is forestry. We'd had an agreement about a year ago on forestry between the Pacific Northwest, which is so important. They said, okay, we won't change that agreement in the free trade agreement. So they left that aside. Now there were some areas that were give and take. For example, one area, interestingly enough, is in the uranium industry. Canada has a very productive modern uranium industry. There are certain interests in this country, particularly more in the southwest in this area, who were very worried about the competition they're going to have from the Canadian uranium industry. But simply the Canadians said that we're a secure supply of uranium fuel for the future. Therefore, we want this part of the agreement. The Americans basically went along with this. Now the Americans are going to make sure that their industry over a 10-year period is given some ability to compete with the Canadian industry. So that was an area where Canada got what they wanted. The Americans perhaps had to give in. Other areas were a little bit different in farm products, and that some areas Canada's had to give in, particularly in the area I might mention of liquor. In the terms of liquor and wine trade, Canadian was very concerned about the imports of wine from Washington State, California, and that. But the Canadians simply had to decide that in this area we had to go with a free trade agreement. And so there's going to be a 10-year period where we're going to have to compete.
You've already mentioned the extent of the trade that exists between the United States and Canada presently. Looking down the road, 10 years from now, assuming that this agreement is adopted by both countries, what's the net effect going to be, do you think?
Basically, all free trade arrangements around the world have done nothing but increase trade. Basically, when you increase trade, of course, you lower the price of products in each of the country because each country works on the area that actually it's got a trade advantage or a price advantage or whatever you want to say. So I think, basically this trade has been increasing, particularly in the 1980s, and as I see it in the future, it'll probably even speed up. There'll be a greater deal of trade between us. And I think also it will make this market better able to compete with other markets in the world. Particularly, we're so concerned about the rise of the Pacific Rim countries and that. And I think this will make it a more integrated market, better able to compete in Asia, for example.
Janelle already mentioned the special relationship that exists between the two countries, the common border, the exchange of people. Will this step, which I see is bringing us even closer, will it do anything, you think, to affect the one barrier that remains, and that's the difference in the currencies? Is that being discussed at all?
Well, there was some talk about discussion of currencies, but basically both sides decided you can't talk about discussion of currencies because the currencies are now being set by a free market system. In other words, basically every day they get up in the market in Chicago and they decide what the Canadian dollar is going to be worth versus the American dollar. And so in order to have adjusted commercial interest rates or monetary rates would have involved government intervening in the economy. And basically the idea of the free trade agreement was to, as much as possible, let the market dictate what happens. Incidentally, while the American dollar, of course, has fallen over the last 10 years or so, the Canadian dollar has fallen in tandem with the American dollar. Most recently, however, I might mention the Canadian dollar is actually going up against the American dollar, which will make your goods, of course, more competitive in Canada.
Janelle Bird.
An area that's very important to this region is forestry. You have some great forests in Canada. How do you see the American and the Canadian forestry industries working together, if you do, and what do you see as the results of that in the future?
Interestingly enough, like I've mentioned, the free trade agreement won't have a great effect on the agreements that are already in place concerning the forestry industry.
Do you think they're effective? Are the agreements that are presently in place effective?
Yes, I understand that the forestry industry in the Pacific Northwest really had a difficult time after the recession in 1982. But I understand actually it's coming back fairly well, particularly in the state of Idaho. Now, your employment hasn't come back, but apparently that's not going to come back. Simply, you've become more efficient in your forestry industries, you're better able to compete, and yet your employment, you don't have that many employed there. So I think that basically we've gone through a period of adjustment, and the future looks rosy for both sides of the border. Now, some people have claimed that in Canada we've got a lot more forest, but also some people have claimed that we're cutting to a greater extent. Also, interestingly enough, to a great extent, the forest industry is specialized in certain areas where Canada might have one type of lumber specializing perhaps in plywood or something like that. You people are more developing in paper and pulp industry and stuff like that. So I think that basically it's going to be competitive, certainly in the future, but it's not going to cause a great deal of difficulty when the free trade agreement comes into effect.
Who manages your Canadian forests? Are most of them in government ownership, and who manages that
That's right.
ownership?
Interestingly enough, in Canada, the provinces have control of the natural resources. So that means, for example, they control forestry, they control water, or the mining industry within the particular province. Now, the federal government does come into play once they ship across international borders. That's international trade. The federal government plays more of a role in this area. But in Canada, the provinces have control of the resources. Now, this is very different in this country. But it was part of the bargain of Canada that originally the country was set up. The provinces have become very wealthy, very strong, because they control their own resources. So this does mean that from one province to another, you will get different policies in the area of natural resources and forestry, for example.
I'd also like to talk a little bit about a movement that's been taking place because of some of the economic difficulties, and that has to do with protectionism, and it's been on the rise again. Could you address this issue and what that would do to particularly the economies of Canada and the United States if we moved in the opposite direction where we're going, or particularly the United States and its relationship with Japan? This has been somewhat discussed. What are some of the economic fallouts of taking that route?
I think basically some people see some short-term gain, and I think some people in certain sectors of industry probably see some short-term gain. But I think everybody basically agrees that overall protectionism hurts the overall economies. Basically what it simply does is it protects inefficient industries. Inefficient industries have to charge more for their goods and services. So basically you and I will wind up paying those higher prices for the inefficiencies that exist within that society. So interestingly enough, the free trade agreement, what it simply says is that we have a dispute. We want to protect something. We have to sit down with the other country and decide, is this possible under the free trade agreement? The free trade agreement will not allow either country to bring into effect protectionist laws that are going to damage to either of those two countries. So, for example, they may decide that they do need some laws that protect them against maybe some other third countries, but in relationship to our two countries will be free trade in the future.
I want to ask a question in relation to that as it applies to Canada. In our case, certainly not with Canada, but with some other places in the world, we have lowered our tariffs, or we've had free trade, and goods have been coming in, but we don't have the same kind of reciprocal agreement from that country. Does Canada have that problem with any part of the world where it's a lot easier to get goods to Canada than it is into their countries?
Very much so. Both the United States and Canada are two powers that in fact have very little bilateral trade agreements with other areas of the world. Of course, this is part of the problem. The Europeans seem to be combining in a trade area, different trade blocks and that, and we're left out. That's part of the rationale behind the free trade agreement. We simply have to make sure, guarantee our local markets and trade relationships. So that's actually what we're happening here. Now, Canada, very much, we have just as much trouble with you getting Canadian goods in a number of countries as you do. But we see the bilateral relationship, our agreement, will enable us to bargain more with those third countries. For example, if a third country thinks they're not only going to be kept out of Canada, but also out of the United States or the North American market, they're going to be much more willing to lower their barriers in order to be in our total market rather than as an individual country.
I think it's an important point to make that this is going to impact outside of these two countries.
Very, very much so. I think one of the strongest points about the free trade agreement is going to make this entire North American continent more competitive and a greater market for other people to invest in.
Thank you. Steve Sheen.
Dr. Goddard, I think most of us in this country are bewildered by the way our government works, let alone trying to understand other governments. But I'm going to guess again that there are political implications to a trade agreement like the one we're discussing today. What's happening in Canada on the political scene that will affect the acceptance of the free trade agreement?
As you may know, of course, we called a general election in Canada about a week ago. Under the parliamentary form of government, of course, you can call elections at any time, actually within a 5-year period. This particular government decided, and it was into its 4th year, that it was time to call a general election, and they said the main issue of this general election will actually be the free trade agreement. Now, free trade has been a very important topic in Canada. For the last 2 years, you can talk to any Canadians, and they'll certainly know something about the free trade agreement. It's probably going to be the #1 issue in this upcoming general election. Of Of course, in Canada, once we call an election, we have an election within 55 days. They don't seem to go on and on like yours do, and so we'll know the outcome within a very short period of time. And again, I think one thing, interestingly enough, is the Conservative government, or the Progressive Conservative government, with the current Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, has been very much the one that's been pushing this free trade agreement. The opposition parties are more against it. But I think public opinion polls seem to be showing us that the majority of Canadians, now maybe a narrow majority, seem to favor free trade. And so it looks like that it's probably a pretty good issue to call an election on.
This is maybe very unfair. We had an opportunity recently to visit with a member of the Japanese Council, and he was very hesitant to comment on the upcoming election in this country. But I can't let the opportunity pass. What's the view of many Canadians about the election that's coming up here in November?
Interestingly, I saw a poll about a week, and Canadians, looking at the two presidential candidates, 50% for Dukakis, 50% for Bush. I don't know if that's saying an awful lot.
That's as diplomatic an answer as you could get.
That's about
it's convenient the poll gives him that opportunity to say that.
That's right.
Janelle Berg.
There are many ecological interests that we have also in common. What kinds of things do you think need to be done to protect those common, the air, the water, the forests, ecological interests that we have? What kinds of things have the two countries worked on?
Well, I think one of probably the key thing in this area right now, of course, is the idea of acid rain.
Yes.
I think the Canadian government became very aware of this a number of years ago, and I think we've gone through a long process of educating your country as to what acid rain is and how it's produced and the effects it's having on the environment. This is going to be becoming increasingly important. Of course, we have literally thousands, 40,000 lakes in Canada now that do not have any fish or things like that due to the acidity of the lake. Now, I think the thing that should be realized, of course, is both countries produce acid rain. So it's a problem we have to work together on. Interestingly enough, I think, though, that we have a trade relationship here, and I think the thing is that Canada's got an unfair balance of trade. We actually are receiving more from you than we're sending down to you. So it's been a very important issue in Canada for some time to come to some sort of arrangement on acid rain. Now, interestingly enough, we've had success recently. In fact, they took another poll in this country, and they found out that once it was explained to Americans the effect of acid rain, that overwhelmingly, something like 68% of the American people are totally in favor of solving the acid rain problem, even to the extent they're willing to invest more to clean up this particular problem and create higher standards for the future. So I think it looks good. It looks good in this area, but we have to probably move a little faster. I think one difficulty we've had is convincing the Americans to actually meet certain standards within certain time periods. They now admit that it's a problem. We've had difficulty saying, okay, when are we going to clean it up, by what date? Canadians are much more willing to say, we will reduce it 40% within a certain time period. I think this is something, though, that we're going to have perhaps better luck with working with the new administration, no matter which political party it comes from, than we've had in the past.
I would like to deal with another question on the environment. Here in this country, we have had a lot of dialogue concerning air and water pollution. We have national legislation, the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, although we debate whether or not sometimes that's energetically enforced or the regulations are proper. Since you've indicated earlier on the program that the natural resources are basically under the control of the province, how do you deal with your protection of the air and water at the national level, or is this also something the province has lots of control over?
No, basically within the Canadian federal system, these things that are trans-border, and particularly trans-border internationally, are dealt with at the federal level in Canada. Also, in Canada, the tendency when a problem is newly developed, it generally falls to a federal power. And what I'm simply saying is that during the original formation of Canada, resources, everybody knew about that, so they gave it to the provinces. People didn't know so much about pollution way back in 1867, so this has fallen to a national jurisdiction. So basically we're dealing on a national relationship here. Now, there's no doubt about it that, for example, some of the Columbia River Treaty, for example, pollution in the water area, certainly provinces would have to be involved. There's no way that the federal government could tell a province to clean it up. A province would have to cooperate with the federal government. So it's a bargaining process. But generally in these areas, we've had the provinces cooperating with the federal government in this area. It's not a problem, really, a basic problem. Incidentally, one of the historic agreements between the two countries came about from an international court case right within this area, of course, with Trail, British Columbia, and the smelter creating pollution on this side of the line. And that historic case, of course, the pollution was flowing from British Columbia into Washington State. The international court case forced the Canadians to comply with these clean air standards in those days. And of course, this is a historic agreement, international agreement. Everybody recognized the Trail Smelter case. And so it's a very important agreement, and it was right in this area.
On this side of the border, we have had a very serious problem that doesn't get a lot of attention these days, but in the field of economics it does, and it has to do with deficit funding of our national budget, which has been a very serious problem for a number of years. Was there any discussion as this agreement has unfolded about free trade and how that might impact as we create more jobs and more trade, that may impact in a positive way, generating more revenue through the tax structure as the economy improves?
Interestingly enough, your trade relationship with the United States, while you may have a deficit in the trade area of goods, you've got a surplus in the trade area of services. So between Canada and the United States, we generally have very balanced trade. So your deficit in the trade area basically isn't a Canadian problem. It usually has something more to do with Japan in particular than Canada. So this agreement really probably won't have a great effect. Now, to the extent we become more efficient, our trade good becomes more cheaper, we'll probably be able to do better internationally, so it'll help the deficit. Now, I'd like to also point out that Canada has a trade deficit internationally, actually, so we're in somewhat the same boat as you. And like I mentioned, our currency is going down, being devalued too, for these same reasons. So I think basically we've got two countries with similar economies that are going to have to work their way out of that particular problem together.
I was partially speaking to the fact is that if we create a more prosperous economy and more jobs created domestically, then that affects the domestic budget.
Sure.
I wish we could continue this. I know I speak for the panel and our staff when I say you have been one of the most informative guests we've had in a long time. We have a lot of good guests, but you have been just most stimulating with your thoughts and ideas. And I also want to say that we get a tremendous reaction to our program from our Canadian friends and citizens, and it's overdue that we have someone of your ability and caliber from our neighbor, and we appreciate that very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to congratulate you concerning about this problem. I think I've been over to the state of Idaho more than all the other states put together talking about trade and the free trade agreement. And I really congratulate you.
Thank you. It's so nice to have you here. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Arthur Goddard, who is with the Canadian Consulate Office in Seattle. He's the Political, Economic, and Academic Relations Officer with that government, and we've been so happy to have this program. I'd like to take this opportunity to invite you to be with us again next week at this same time, and we will discuss what we believe to be an important subject. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at the same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by an NIC student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.